Matthew, that's right, Matthew 18. It's 3 back here, Lynn. I don't know if you probably already had it loaded up for me, but in case you didn't. We started a little bit last week. We mainly talked about Diocletian and his impact, negative impact on the church. And we talked a little bit about Constantine last week, and that's who we're going to spend today talking about as well. I'll give you a little bit of a quick recap of how Constantine came to power in Rome, why that's important for the Romans and for the Christians in Rome as well. Probably hope if I turned it on. Hit the present back here thing, Landon. There we go. Well, that's you, not me. Well, he's figuring that out. Diocletian was the last emperor, the last Roman emperor that persecuted the Christians and increased some persecution quite a bit in the beginning of the 4th century of Rome. Now, we've not quite faced, obviously, here in America, the same persecutions that the early Christian church did. But we can, as Christians here, be supportive of those other Christians around the world who are going through those types of persecutions. Now, there are countries today that are persecuting Christians. You know, we talked a little bit about that last week. Places in China, North Korea, Iran, Middle Eastern countries. A lot of those things are causing those missionaries and Christians who are there have to go underground or do a variety of things they have to do for fear of persecution. Again, we don't have to deal with those things, but it's important for us as a free country here, free, loving, Christians, that we openly are able to express our religious beliefs. It's important for us to make sure that we are praying for those Christians who are being impacted around the world. Okay, I think a lot of times it's easy for us to be able to get a little soft, a little easy, a little complacent in our own Christian faith because we don't deal with near the persecution as well. We good? We're not good. It's okay. If you want to just click to the second point, is that me or you?
That's me.
Yeah, I'll just holler at you. Just click. Go to the second, Roman numeral there. It says, there you go. You can go ahead and just run through those. I think go back one. There we go. Stay right there. So that brings us to Constantine and how he was able to change the idea in Rome of the church. I was not talking about that, though. I'm talking about important for us as Christians to make sure we're praying for those other Christians that are being persecuted, have to go through those things. There's areas around the world where Christians are strung up or thrown in jail or beaten or, a whole bunch of terrible things that happen to them. So, again, important for us to be, I think aware of that, one, thankful that we're not having to deal with that, two, and then thirdly, we're praying for those Christians that are having, kind of dealing with those problems that are going on. All right, so now that brings us to Constantine. All right, so now we're going to shift a little bit. And just quickly, I talked about this a little bit last week towards the end. Usually towards the end of stuff, I get going even faster than I usually go. So to tell you how Constantine got to where he was, I'll go through this again. 306, 307 to 315 or so AD, the 4th century. Diocletian, of course, was the ruler in Rome before Constantine. Diocletian took Rome and essentially split it up into what we called last week into little parishes or different realms, essentially. And from those realms, he then put somebody in charge and then put somebody underneath the person in charge. Kind of like a principal and a vice principal, right? Kind of the same idea. Of course, they called them governors and vice governors, or emperors and vice emperors and governors. Okay? Constantinus was Constantine's father, and he was one of the governors of one of the regions. Okay? And one of the four emperors, excuse me. He ruled in the area of Gaul, and Diocletian's belief is by dividing these Rome up and giving it to the four realms, it's going to keep civil wars down from happening as well, because people are going to kind of be able to govern their own way for the most part. They had some loosely rules they had to follow, of course, for Rome, but those emperors were kind of allowed in those divisions to kind of come up with their own things. Because civil wars in the early 8th centuries of Rome were very common, happened all the time, especially when leadership changed. Constantinus died in 306, and the army they really liked Constantine, his son, and they essentially put him in charge of the army with really there's some background. Constantine's a pretty good warrior, was there and did some stuff, but he was pretty much just an average Joe. But he was a very good leader of men, and they just liked him a whole lot. So they put him as in charge of the army, and by 312, Constantine actually went into war with the Emperor of Rome, Maxentius, crossed the Alps, camps on the north side of the Alps, and took over the Milvian Bridge, which is a big area of transport and commerce that was going on. And while he was there at the Milvian Bridge, I think I mentioned this last week, but he had a dream, and in this vision, or he had a dream or a vision, in this vision he saw a cross come down with words on it that said "conquer." Now, it could have been just Constantine's way of trying to divinely put okay for what he was doing, or it could have actually been God kind of giving him some direction. Most theologians, most people kind of study this, Constantine, as they write, wasn't an embellisher, wasn't one that was kind of make stuff up. They kind of feel this was somewhat probably divinely led, God trying to move the church into the later centuries here early on. So they took that cross that said "conquer," put it on the army, put it on their shields and stuff. Divine sign on the shields of his soldiers. And eventually his forces there prevail, and he becomes the emperor of the Western Empire. And he led in the Western Empire until 324 AD. That's when he defeated the Eastern Empire, his rival, which was Licinius, and then so by 325, Constantine is the sole emperor of the entire Empire of Rome. Okay, so he's kind of the guy he took over. This becomes important because Constantine puts in favor of the Christian church in Rome. Okay, so it was very easy to see kind of God kind of leading. We don't see this in Scripture, obviously. It was very easy to see God kind of leading Constantine in this direction because it's going to allow the Christianity to flourish even more in Rome. Okay. Again, we don't know Constantine's spiritual commitment. We talked about that last week. We don't see it really written anywhere. We know that his dad worshipped the sun. But at some point, Constantine obviously had at least some sort of spiritual enlightenment as far as Christianity goes, because he changes what was instituted there for the empire and for the church. So, Constantine enacted laws that reversed the imperial policies of persecuting Christians or awarding people for turning in Christians, showed them favor. He annuls the laws that were going on during the Diocletian years against Christianity, took the Christians that were in prison and released them, gave them back their property, gave them back their land, helped them rebuild their abbeys and their churches and things as well in Rome during this time. He took the bishops and exempted them from paying taxes, passed overall just legislation of higher moral standards throughout all of Rome. And as we mentioned, it's kind of what we finished with last week. For a Christian that had been living underneath the Diocletian reign, and then Constantine comes in and all this stuff beginning to happen in our favor, the reaction here of Christians is obviously going to be, first of all, jubilation, and maybe a little tentative at first, thinking maybe this is real or not, because they've had such a long period of time, so much persecution. But you can kind of see how the people here, Christians, are going to have this jubilation that kind of sets in as the reality of the situation that's going on. Okay, Constantine, in his rule, sets a trajectory of the rules and the way that he governed, pretty much changes the Western world. Right? He's our founding fathers, a lot of the stuff they studied Constantine and some of the philosophers at his time when they were writing our own Constitution and Declaration of Independence. He kind of shaped the Western world in the way in which the policies that he kind of came up with. For the first time in history, Christianity was favored religion. Constantine separates church and state. He doesn't merge those things together. That doesn't happen for another about 70 years. Now, other religions, the paganisms, the things that were going on were still legal, and that was the most prevalent religion in Rome, obviously, but it wasn't the only one that was considered to be able to be practiced within the Roman Empire. Constantine here charts a course for the empire and the Christian church to have a relationship of cooperation. Okay, Constantine very severely reacts to heresy and divisions that were going on in the church. Anything that threatened the church's stability, he was very quick to kind of come in and help rule on or kind of take care of. Was very, very quick and concise in his rulings on those types of things, because he understood that if the church was not stable, the foundations of Rome would not be stable as well. That's kind of how he considered things. His vision in the church is going to affect the stability of his own empire. So near the end of the 4th century, Christianity here is declared as the state religion in Rome. Okay, and the next guy that came in after Constantine is Theodosius, and he was the one that declared Christianity the Roman religion. Several years later, Theodosius also then declared the worship of paganism to be illegal. All right, so we're seeing a total 180 flip here on the idea of Christianity in Rome. So church buildings in Rome now began to reflect imperial tastes of artistry, the grandeur of Rome, and all the kind of things that you would imagine. Buildings began to kind of take on those types of constructions. Pre-Constantine era is pretty basic. It was just whatever they could get together whatever they could put together to get together, essentially. And now, after Constantine, these more elaborate and beautiful buildings are being built. Okay, that brings us to our part C. There, Constantine's patronage of the church. All right, so vicious persecution now, of course, that took place at the hand of Constantine's former rivals. Christians looked upon Constantine as a blessing from God, okay, and looked at the policies that he was putting into place as part of God's providence during this time. Persecution was over. New laws are defending Christianity now. There's even taxes, imperial funds that are being used to help rebuild churches. It's kind of hard to imagine Christians having really any other response but joy here. And as a result, Constantine then had unprecedented power over the church. Okay? And his influence within that is seen in a church controversy that kind of breaks out in northern Africa. All right, so during the Great Persecution, there were some bishops in North Africa that actually took scriptures and handed them over to the authorities, and the authorities burned them, okay, because they didn't want to be caught with them. They knew they would be in trouble if they had them. There were some other bishops that, of course, would accuse those bishops of being traitors, as you can imagine would take place. Okay, you got the division that turned over the scriptures. You're going to have people who, I've never done that, and then cause them of being traitors, accuse them of being traitors. Say they had no right to continue as bishops, they shouldn't be in the church, they could be excommunicated altogether, and claim that the bishops who had done this were ordained by traitors who were not truly ordained, and therefore they had to be baptized by them and needed to be rebaptized. Okay, so the people who didn't burn the scriptures are accusing the people who did burn the scriptures of essentially not even being true baptized believers and bishops who have been ordained in the ways of the church. Okay, so you can see where this division, you can see where some spats took place here. All right. The Bishop of Rome favored forgiving the bishops. Okay, but the second group, which became known as the Donatists, argued that to do so would leave the church impure. In 311, Chalcedon was elected the bishop, but the Donatists opposed him because he allowed himself to be consecrated by a bishop who had surrendered the scriptures. All right, I know this seems a little kind of wordy and heavy here. This is getting to a point. It's actually a pretty interesting event that took place. So the new bishop was ordained by the people who burnt the scriptures. The Donatists, who the people who didn't burn the scriptures, they don't accept him as being the official bishop of the Church of Rome. Are you with me? Is that you? Okay. All right. So the Donatists, they appealed to Rome, and then Constantine steps in. All right. So Constantine is going to order arbitration here in the midst of this problem. So after 3 years, this was a 3-year controversy that took place. Constantine supports the final decision in 316 to recognize Cecilian, the new appointed bishop of Rome, as innocent of being a traitor. Constantine then claims that the Donatists were separating from the one true church. Now, Lance, why is this important? Okay, it's the first time in church history that a secular ruler is asked to make a legal decision on a division within the church. All right, so now we see the government kind of stepping in and helping make decisions between members of the church. Okay, first time that's ever taken place. Obviously, when that decision came down, the Donatists are not going to be happy with that, right? This is a little different world than we're living in today. These people don't just lay down and take things, right? They're not happy with this. Despite the decision, the Donatists maintained that they, in fact, were the true church. The Church of Rome was not the true church. So from 317 to 321, Constantine tries to use force for about 5 years to force and persuade them to return to the church and be reconciled. Okay. Of course, some government officials trying to tell you how to worship, what you should believe. We can see where that's going to just make matters worse, not better, which is exactly what happened. The Donatists got mad, made things worse. So eventually, by 321, because they would not essentially bend the knee, he reluctantly grants them toleration. Okay. In the end, the two church groups coexist in North Africa, with each of them claiming to be the true church. Lane, will you go ahead and jump to the next slide, please? Okay. So the Roman Colosseum and the Arch of Constantine, which is what we're seeing here. Okay. Let me read this to you, so I want to make sure I get this right. This is a monument that Constantine put up to his rule and a symbol of Christianity as a state church. The Roman Colosseum had long been as a symbol of persecution of Christians, but note that Romans most likely never killed Christians in the amphitheater itself. Their thirst for blood and casual view of life prevalent in the amphitheater is at what times propelled the martyrdoms of countless Christians throughout the Roman Empire. So this is the Arch of Constantine, as you see on the right-hand side. That is the Colosseums, which was using the persecution of the church. Constantine is here. At first started out in a lot of good, but as most rulers do, power most of the time corrupts absolutely, and we see him kind of interject himself in and want to control the church. Okay? So for us sitting here today, which of these do you think would be worse? Having the state persecute the church, or having the state control the church's affairs? And you don't have to answer that out loud, just kind of a thought. Which would be worse, the persecution of the church by the state, or having the state coming in and trying to control your affairs? In which of those two scenarios do you think it would be the hardest to maintain purity in your doctrine? Right? both of them would be a very, very difficult thing to fight. That's what the early church is kind of dealing with here, right? So we can look back at history and think, man, those people shouldn't have done that, but we can also kind of put it into context, can see why maybe, for instance, the bishops there in North Africa may have turned the scriptures over, and why the other ones didn't, and we can kind of see both sides of the aisle here. I think both of those situations would be very, very difficult to maintain doctrinal purity. I think that it would be harder, personally, this is just my opinion, it's a Lanciism, I think it would be harder to operate in a environment in which the state is trying to control your affairs, as opposed to going ahead and operating as you want to, but maybe get persecuted from it later. Okay, I like to think that we would be a lot smarter than the government. We could figure out ways to get around what they're trying to do and still continue to do what we wanted to. They can't just, they're going to persecute us. So that's fine. They caught us. But them actually coming in and trying to dictate us, I think that would be much more difficult for us to kind of deal with, and being able to kind of go do our own thing and essentially worry with the consequences later. Kind of how I see it. That's just me. You might be different. All right? All right, Landon, go ahead to the next one, please. One more to D. There we go. So, Constantine participates here in the Council at Nicaea. Again, further showing the influence over the church. Soon after, he moved his capital to the newly founded and built Constantinople, all right, which is present-day Istanbul, which is Istanbul's not there. Present-day Iran, Iraq, around in that area, all right. He learned of a novel teaching in the East proposed by a man named Arius of Alexandria. Arius's new teaching, of course, was called Arianism. All right. Arius believed that Christ was a created being rather than a divine Son of God, and Constantine responded by calling a council of bishops to the city of Nicaea. Take some tax money, imperial funds, to pay the way for over 300 bishops to attend the council. Now, this may seem like not a big deal, but the Council of Nicaea ends up being kind of a pretty big point as far as church history. If you were to take a church history class or watch a YouTube video on church history, things build to the Council of Nicaea. Kind of a big deal that took place. Constantine, of course, is going to proceed over this council and have them participate in these discussions. Now, all but two bishops are going to condemn Arius' new teaching. Constantine sides with the majority of bishops and then condemns Arius as well and exiles him. All right, this would be a win for the church. Ordinarily, the church disciplines its own members, including its leaders. In this case, however, Constantine exiles Arius. In essence, what he's doing here is that he is, once again, kind of circumnavigating the bishop's role of them disciplining Arius. He's kind of stepping in and doing that himself. So he once again interjecting himself into the ways of the church. He took a role that formerly belonged to the church. His actions then become the normal pattern. So the emperor or the guy in charge stepping in to help make decisions in the church. Because Constantine did this, and Constantinople, it's important for us, Rome right now is flourishing, right? Constantinople is the hub. Everything is happening. Constantinople is like New York City, but times a million, right? Everything's going on there. It's flourishing. All kinds of stuff are happening. So he's stepping in and taking charge there in Rome, or in the church. That becomes the normal pattern now for the next 1,400 years. Next century and a half, you're going to have Roman emperors or people in charge stepping in to help make decisions in the church. Now, that brings us to Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 down through 18. Contrary to what Scripture is going to tell us, that Constantine was doing was wrong. What Constantine was doing was incorrect. This is the biblical pattern for church discipline, all right? This is what the bishops would have had in their hands. They would have been able to read this, all right? Verse 15, moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell them his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, often take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it to the church. But if neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall bound in heaven. Whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So the biblical pattern of church discipline is what? Give me just a quick 3 or 4 word kind of just a real quick synopsis of it. Church, the biblical basis of church discipline is what? The church should do what?
Deal with its own problems.
Deal with its own problems, right? Me and Pastor Rob got a problem, we should hash it out. If I won't listen to Pastor Rob, think he's being, a stinker butt, as people would say. He's not wanting to listen to anything, and then we bring a couple more people in, and we try to hash the thing out. And eventually it should take, if 2 God-fearing Christians, eventually it should take care of itself. Constantine's discipline of Arius is unbiblical, right? And it's going to set an unbiblical precedent for coming people that the state should be involved with the church, and that is just not the case. Go over to Romans chapter 13 with me. Romans chapter 13, look at verse 8. God actually gives some authority, or actually talks about the authority of the state here. Romans chapter 13, verse 4, sorry. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he that beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the what? Minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Now he's talking specifically about government there, okay? God gives authority to the state to do what? What's the state in charge of? Carrying out what? The law, carrying out justice. It's important for there to be laws. There's importance for there to be consequences for breaking laws, right? That's the job of the state. They're there to authorize and carry out justice. They're there to carry out justice. That's what their job there. And the New Testament does not authorize the state to carry out church discipline. Somebody breaks the law for speeding, they should pay the fine or do whatever the case may be. The church, we shouldn't have Governor Northam roll up in here and trying to solve the dispute between me and Pastor Rob. Okay, that shouldn't happen. And that's kind of the way God kind of set things up. All right. So Constantine's action is a distortion of biblical teachings, and both the church and the state. All right, Landon, next one. So because of this, there's some lingering effects here that Constantine has on Christianity because of his dealing becoming the precedent for quite some time. Now, there is no record anywhere of anyone kind of asking some crucial questions here about Constantine stepping in. We don't see the bishops of Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, kind of stepping in and asking. Hey, they would have known what Matthew chapter 18 said. Right? They would have probably preached it from their churches. We don't see any record of them kind of stepping in and saying, hey, you're not supposed to be doing this. A couple questions they probably should have asked. For example, how would Constantine's division affect the state's role in the church? How might the church's integrity be affected by having imperial support and authority? What would the church retain in its own governing? Or would the state always kind of rely on, or the church always rely on the state? Would the gospel remain death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Or would the good news be confused with a new form of civic religion called Christianity? There's the great problem with Constantine and the things that kind of stepped in during this time, right? The church is being funded by taxpayers. The church is getting government support. At what point does the church then allow the government to kind of manipulate the message that's being preached in churches? Right? When does the gospel change? Because the church, or because the state wants it to. Government's a good thing, guys, but it's not here to control us. It's here to kind of direct us. And we all know this very well. You give the government stuff, there's never a time in history they've given it back. Right? It doesn't happen. We went from 1 mask to 3 masks now. We thought at some point this was going to quit. Now we're doing 3. I mean, we can kind of see how this thing's going, right? They don't usually just relinquish stuff back to the people. That's why it's important that we keep them out of churches, because they're not going to give much back. They won't. That's not what they do. One of the most dangerous things that the government can say to the church or say to anybody is say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. It's not what we want. It's not a good thing. We see it intrinsically involved here in the early centuries of the church, right? People were just as power hungry then as they are now. Okay, so it's important that that's there. It's important. Got to have government. Got to have laws. We can't be allowing it to become our compass for right and wrong and all those things as well, because they will influence and change. As we get into the Middle Ages, we're going to see some of that stuff kind of happen. Okay. How can the church keep a pure membership when the state promised benefits to those who join the church? Just a few questions that probably should have been asked by the Christians that were in the time of Constantine. I'm going to finish up here. Just a couple more questions for us. So Christians assume that because they aren't experiencing persecution, that God must be pleased with their actions. Now, the Bible is the standard for whether believers are living for God. The absence or presence of persecution is not necessarily a good or bad sign of God's blessings. Christians in Constantine's days attempted to relegate Christian living to keep the state happy. They weren't careful. Religion becomes just another list of actions in their relationship with God. Judah faced the same thing in their time, all the way back in Isaiah. Isaiah confronts them from their actions as well. So let's finish up with that. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 1. We see the same thing happening way back here in the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 1, and we'll look at the verses 10 through 15. Kind of see the same happenstance here going on. Hear the word of the Lord, ye rulers of Sodom. Give ear unto the law of our God, ye people of Gomorrah. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifice unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or lambs or goats. When ye come to appear before me, who hath required this at your hand to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations, incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbath, calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hateth, and they are trouble unto me. I am weary to bear them. And when ye spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. So all the things that Judah was doing to kind of appease God, right? Or appease the gods, or all the different legalistic things they were running through. Going through the motions, right? Simply just making sacrifices because they knew they had to. Showing up at church because they knew they were supposed to. Putting some money in the offering because they knew that was just part of it. Just kind of haphazardly going through the motions. What does God say of that? What does he say of those things, of that heartless worship? He soundly does what? Hates it, rejects it. Doesn't want anything to do with it. Would rather us not even do it at all if we're going to do it kind of haphazardly and just heartless worship. Faith that shows itself in diligently seeking God is what pleases God. Hebrews 11:6 says that specifically. Faith that shows itself in diligently seeking God. One more time before we land and we'll finish up. I thought I had one more slide. No, I don't. All right, so that brings us to the end of the 4th century, middle of the 4th century, and we'll look now moving into the 5th century, but next week now we're going to kind of shift away from historical stuff and move into doctrine stuff, all right? So we're going to look at the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of Christology as well. Of course, Pastor Rob did a much better job than I'll ever do going over this, but we're going to see more kind of the historical aspect of it and how we got to where we got to as far as what we teach. Early church Christology, the early church councils. We'll talk about the Council of Nicaea again. There's another Council of Constantinople we have to talk about as well. Ephesus has a council as well, talking about how they're teaching Trinity and the doctrine of Christology in the church. So we'll start off by going over what those are, and then how the church dealing with the controversies that happened with them as well. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you again, being able to look back at the church through the ages so that we can stay true to your way. That at times we think, wow, I'll be looking at some of these guys with these crazy names and what they were doing. This has no bearing or effect on us when it kind of does. How it will be important, the same thing that they were dealing with, the same things that we're dealing with, the same things that our grandkids deal with, and so on and so forth. That the ever-present threat of people destroying the true nature of the church because of their sinful ways. It's a constant threat. It's a constant battle we're dealing with. As much as we can learn, as much as we can glean, as much as we can see all the other different people and how they dealt with stuff, it's important for us to be able to see those things so that we have a response as well when that time comes. Hopefully it doesn't, but it may. So I pray, Lord, as we continue to look through this, as we continue to see the importance of kind of looking at some history here. I pray for Pastor Rob, too, as he comes here in the next little bit. So just use him in a mighty way, Lord. Keep us attentive to the word this morning that you have for us. In your name I pray.